You're watching Mint Wide Angle. I'm Anindya Chakravarti, and today I'm going to talk about the top 5 things that the Modi government needs to do in Budget 2020 to bring the economy back on track, which means create more jobs, encourage consumer spending, and revive investment in the economy. Number 1, spend more and forget the fiscal fundamentalists. When the economy isn't doing well, when things aren't selling, when profits are down, it's a bit silly to expect the corporate sector, the private sector to invest more. Why? Because corporates, whether they're big or small, invest and spend when they expect their businesses to grow, when their profits will increase. At a time when profits are shrinking, you cannot expect them to spend. At a time like that, it's only the government which can spend, and it must spend to boost the economy. And that brings us to point number 2. The government has to target its spending. It's not just going to be some general spending. It has to be spending in sectors which create a lot of jobs. And not just jobs, but quality jobs. And contrary to popular wisdom, that's not going to be in infrastructure. Because when you build roads and bridges, what happens? Other than a few engineers and supervisors and managers, the bulk of the people who get jobs are low-skilled manual laborers who go away to the village during agricultural seasons and then migrate on particular projects. These jobs are not sustainable, and they definitely do not lead to a sustained improvement in the quality of life of the bulk of workers in infrastructure projects. And that brings us to point number 3. The government needs to use this opportunity of the slowdown and break away from the economic policies that we've been following since the time of Rao-Manmohan reforms of 1991. It is time for the government to actually re-enter the economy. Not through the public sector necessarily, but by deciding what is going to be produced, how much is going to be produced, and by whom. This can be done by actually giving contracts to private players, especially SMEs. Because they do that when they build roads and when they build bridges. Government gives contracts to private manufacturers, tells them what to do, how much to do, gives them a timeline, and that follows up on it. The same thing can be done to produce things that common people use, whether it's textiles or low-cost consumer goods. Point number 4, stop the band-aid solution. Stop giving tax incentives, either to income tax payers or to corporate. What happens when income tax payers like us end up with more money in our hands? At a time when consumer sentiment is down, we don't spend more because we're scared of spending more. So we save it for a rainy day. The same thing happens when corporates get tax incentives at a time when their goods aren't selling. What do? They end up increasing their profit margins and returning some money to their investors, and even investing their cash in financial instruments instead of buying machines and hiring more people. If taxes have to be cut, it has to be given to companies with a strict employment target. If they meet it, they get the tax incentive. If they don't and take tax incentives, then they can be fined or even punitive taxes can be put on them. That brings us to my final point, point number 5. Improve what the agricultural expert Devendra Sharma calls the ease of doing farming. Recently, the finance minister gave some tax incentives to the corporate sector, and she said that it's going to cost her about 1.45 lakh crore in taxes. If that money had been added to PM Kisan and given to farmers instead, each farming family would have ended up with about 10 to 12,000 rupees extra for the entire year. That might not be much for you and me, but remember that a lot of farmers earn less than 20,000 rupees per year. So that extra money would end up being invested in agriculture, and they'd also end up buying low-cost consumer goods and give a boost to the economy. Along with that, Budget 2020 has to ensure that farmers get better access to credit. Remember, almost 80% of them do not have institutional credit, and also encourage, with monetary incentives, farmers' cooperatives in key crops. Because we've seen how that works in milk. For instance, Amul and Mother Dairy successfully retailing and distributing milk through farmers' cooperatives. That can be done in onions and many other key crops, which would lead to stable prices for both consumers and for farmers. So these are 5 things that the finance minister can do in Budget 2020 to address the immediate problem the economy is facing, but also to reset it structurally for the long term. Because as the former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, the economist Rathin Roy says, India's economy needs antibiotics, not just painkillers.